Let's turn to our next guest, who says the Powell probe will not only delay the confirmation for the next Fed chair, it could change who the nominee will be. Let's bring in Dan Clifton, head of policy research at Strategas, which is a Baird company. Dan, it's good to see you, and what are you thinking?
Well, great to see you, Kelly. Well, first, this is an unforced error. The downside was much greater than the upside of being able to do this. And I always thought that there was an informal agreement since last summer between Trump and Powell that if Powell agrees to leave the Fed when his chairmanship ends in May, then Trump will not bring up the construction project anymore. And that line was crossed on Sunday, one way or another. And that has all sorts of implications. I think Emily did a very good job of outlining the confirmation process. But one, it makes it more likely that Powell can stay on as on a seat as a regular member, and that's a very important seat. I think the Trump administration needed that seat for financial deregulation, possibly even some rates. And now you're going to see maybe like a shadow Fed if he decides to stay on. Of course, this may all change over 5 months, but it does increase the likelihood of that happening. And then second is that, as Emily laid out, it doesn't tell you who, it doesn't create a path for the Senate to begin to move the president's the president's Fed chairman pick. And that's important because we were expecting it over the next couple of weeks. And then if you take it, a lot of these senators have very good close relationships with Kevin Hassett. They like him, but they're now going to be less likely to move forward on a Hassett nomination. And I think what that does is it raises the odds of Kevin Warsh and probably even some of the other people who are on the list, like Waller or even Rick Reeder, because they're not going to be as tied to the president now that the independence is being questioned.
So thank you, Dan, for laying all of that out. And you have explained the big picture of what could have happened this year, which was the Fed board changes, the president gets more of his appointees in place. They do a lot of financial deregulation, which the bank stocks were obviously very excited about. You're saying this calls all of that into question. It almost feels then like it's the biggest setback for the president's agenda that he could possibly be facing this year. So
absolutely. And I would say we were in an amazing place. I mean, the backdrop here for the U.S. economy is so great. We got $400 billion of tax cuts. We got the Fed cutting rates. We got the Fed balance sheet expanding $57 billion a month. You got financial deregulation coming down. That's why I would call it an unforced error. But Kelly, this is so offsides that it's probably going to pass at some point. And the president's going to need to move this process forward to get his new Fed chairman in. And we may be talking about 4 months from now, like how this was all a big head fake at the end of the day and nothing really materialized out of it. So I don't want to say it's a total setback, but it definitely created a hurdle for the president that could set back his entire agenda.
Yeah.
Look at what happened today. Inflation numbers came out. Inflation declined in 2025 despite all the tariffs. That's the message today. You go to the Detroit Economic Club, inflation's coming down, growth's coming. And instead you're having conversations about this or credit card swipe fees or caps on credit cards. It just shows you that midterm election years are very different for governing than the first year of a presidency. And that first year was get all your economic plans in place. And that second year, these presidents get much more populist to win voters, and it creates uncertainty for investors.
Yeah. So, and also, what are we now waiting on? Maybe you can give us the sort of legal explanation here of the DOJ's probe, because you're saying all of this depends on the time frame with which the president can now make his appointment, that it moves through committee, moves through the Senate, that we then figure out if Powell, you're sort of almost saying he would almost have to stay on while this is all being. So how quickly should we expect the DOJ to move along? What are the next data points to wait for?
Well, I'll tell you, I read the DOJ statement last night as they're starting to walk this back a little bit. And they were like, no, it wasn't, an indictment. It was just a subpoena. They're starting to walk that back a little bit. I do think that there's going to be pressure internally on the White House for being able to do that. And to Emily's report before this segment started, the Senate can move on the floor without the banking committee if Tom Tillis is saying no. But there are so many Republican senators that have questions about this that you're going to need some sort of resolution. And I think sooner rather than later is the way to go, so you could start moving your Fed process. Now, the president's going to interview Rick Reeder, so he's still not done with that process. But we were anticipating that this decision was going to come in late January of who he was going to select as the Fed chair. That person has to go through a background check and get everything ready for his hearing. And so it usually takes about 100 days for that process to work its way through. And we're coming up to that 100-day limit, which is late January before the Fed chairman. So we thought this process was going to start, and I would expect you're going to start seeing a walk back from this from the administration, given the consequences of how big of a deal this is.